Cold wind howled through the Colorado pines, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside the Leadville saloon that night. Theron Hatcher, a man carved from mountain stone and isolation, just wanted a quiet meal. Instead, a trembling whisper interrupted his dinner. "May we have your leftovers?" Turning, he expected a beggar. What he found was a heavily built woman clutching a starving child. When she raised her head, her shattered, desperate eyes instantly broke his hardened soul. Theron Hatcher had not heard the sound of another human voice in over 6 months. High up in the jagged teeth of the Sawatch Range, the only conversations he engaged in were with the howling winter winds, the snapping branches of ancient ponderosa pines, and the occasional low grunt of a grizzly bear marking its territory. At 42 years old, Theron was a towering monument of a man, standing 6 feet and 4 inches in his scuffed leather boots. His face was hidden beneath a thick, untamed beard the color of rusted iron, and his broad shoulders were draped in a heavy elk hide coat that smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine resin. He preferred the silent company of the high country. People, in his experience, only brought complications, betrayals, and eventually profound grief. It was the winter of 1879, and Leadville, Colorado, was a booming, festering scar on the side of the mountain. The Silver Rush had drawn thousands of desperate souls, greedy prospectors, and ruthless businessmen to the freezing elevation. The streets were an unrecognizable soup of frozen mud, horse manure, and discarded timber. As Theron led his pack mule, Barnaby, down Chestnut Street, the sensory overload was immediate and abrasive. Pianos clattered from hastily constructed saloons. Women of the night shouted from second-story balconies, and the constant rhythmic thud of the stamp mills echoed through the frigid canyon air. Theron hated every inch of it, but a man needed coffee, salt, ammunition, and a proper hot meal before the deep snows locked off the mountain passes entirely. He secured Barnaby at a sturdy hitching post outside Pap Wyman's saloon. It was one of the most famous and notorious establishments in the territory. Wyman, an eccentric proprietor, famously kept a Bible chained to a mahogany desk near the entrance, right beneath a large sign that read, "Don't swear." Nobody paid the sign much mind, especially not tonight. The saloon was packed shoulder to shoulder with unwashed miners, wealthy investors in wool suits, and tired gamblers looking for their next mark. Pushing through the swinging bat-wing doors, Theron's massive frame immediately commanded a silent perimeter. Men naturally stepped aside as he moved toward the long, polished bar. He didn't swagger. He just walked with the heavy, undeniable gravity of a man who survived by his own hands. "Whiskey," Theron rumbled, his voice gravelly from months of disuse. "And the biggest cut of beef you have in the back. Burn it, drown it in gravy, and bring a bucket of potatoes." The bartender, a sweaty, balding man named O'Malley, nodded quickly. Taking the heavy pouch of gold dust Theron dropped on the counter. "Coming right up, mountain man. Find a seat if you can." Theron claimed a small circular table in the far corner of the room, positioning his back firmly against the rough wooden wall. From this vantage point he could survey the entire room. He watched the chaotic symphony of Leadville unfold. Men were losing their life savings at the faro tables. A drunken fight briefly broke out near the spittoons before the combatants were unceremoniously tossed out into the freezing mud. For the next hour, Theron sat in silence, drinking his whiskey, letting the burn of the cheap liquor thaw the ice in his veins. 10 years ago, he had lived a different life. He had been a farmer in Missouri, with a gentle wife named Sarah and a laughing daughter named Clara. Cholera had taken them both within a week of each other. The devastation had hollowed him out, leaving a gaping void that he eventually filled with the silent, unforgiving isolation of the Rockies. He had sworn off humanity. He had built a fortress of ice around his heart, ensuring that nothing and no one could ever hurt him that deeply again. When O'Malley arrived with his plate, Theron's stomach gave a rare, demanding growl. The steak was massive, sizzling in a pool of dark, savory gravy, accompanied by roasted root vegetables and half a loaf of thick, crusty bread. Theron ate methodically, prioritizing sustenance over manners. He consumed the heavy meal with the efficiency of a wild animal, pulling apart the meat and chewing it down while keeping his dark, vigilant eyes scanning the room. He was nearly finished, feeling a rare sense of physical warmth and satisfaction when he noticed the shifting dynamics of the room. A cruel, rolling laughter was spreading from a group of miners near the stove. Theron paused, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. Through the haze of cigar smoke, he saw her. She was standing near the edge of the saloon's warmth, trying desperately to make herself invisible, which was an impossible task. She was a woman of immense physical size, heavily built and broad, wrapped in a tattered, faded calico dress that had been patched together with mismatched scraps of fabric. A frayed woolen shawl was pulled tightly around her broad shoulders. In an era and a harsh frontier town where lean, wiry strength was the norm for survival, her severe obesity made her an anomaly, a target. What the cruel, laughing men didn't know, or didn't care to know, was that her size was not born of gluttony. Her face was pale, puffy with severe edema, the heavy swelling in her legs making every step a monumental, agonizing effort. She was suffocating under the weight of her own failing health and crushing poverty. But it wasn't just the woman that caught Theron's attention. Clinging tightly to the folds of her oversized, worn skirt was a young boy, no older than 5. The child was painfully thin, his cheeks hollow, his large blue eyes darting around the terrifying room like a trapped rabbit. The men near the stove, led by a loud, scarred miner named Bart Clegg, were throwing peanut shells at her feet. "Hey, Martha!" Bart hollered, his voice cutting through the saloon's din. "If you eat any more of the town's scraps, there won't be enough gravity to keep Leadville on the mountain. Why don't you roll on back to the alley?" The men erupted into cruel, vicious laughter. Martha did not look up. She kept her head bowed, her triple chin pressing into her chest, her face burning with a bright, feverish red humiliation. She tightened her grip on her son's small hand. She was desperately scanning the tables, not for sympathy, but for abandoned plates. Theron watched, his jaw tightening. He had seen cruelty in the wild. He had watched wolves tear apart a weak calf. But the cruelty of men was a different, far more sinister breed. The wild was indifferent. Men were malicious. He looked down at his own plate. Half of the massive steak remained, along with a mountain of gravy-soaked potatoes and a thick slice of bread. He was full. He usually left his scraps for the saloon dogs or O'Malley's hogs. He looked back up, and the woman was moving. She was shuffling, her breathing shallow and labored, moving away from the mocking miners and navigating through the labyrinth of tables. She was approaching his corner. Theron sat perfectly still, his hand resting near the heavy hunting knife sheathed at his belt, watching the tragic spectacle unfold as the heavily built woman drew closer to his shadow. The saloon felt suddenly suffocating as Martha Higgins slowly approached the towering mountain man's table. Every step was an exercise in pure agony. Her joints ached with the heavy fluid retention that had plagued her since the complicated birth of her son, Thomas. When her husband, Arthur, was alive, he had loved her regardless of her size, understanding that the weight came from a sickness in her blood, a sickness the town doctor had vaguely called dropsy before shrugging his shoulders. But Arthur had died in a cave-in at the Matchless Mine 8 months ago. Since then, Martha's life had become a living hell. The mining company had immediately evicted her from their company-owned cabin. With no money, failing health, and a severe physical inability to do the grueling laundry or scrubbing work that other frontier widows took on to survive, she had been reduced to begging. The town of Leadville, hardened by greed and silver lust, showed her no mercy. They looked at her massive frame and saw only laziness and gluttony. "How could a starving woman be so fat?" they whispered behind their hands and often right to her face. She swallowed her pride every single day to keep Thomas alive. She would take the insults, the thrown peanut shells, the spitting, and the jeering, as long as she could find a discarded crust of bread or a half-eaten potato for her boy. She stopped beside Theron's table. From her vantage point, the mountain man was terrifying. He looked like a creature born of the forest itself, all leather, fur, and suppressed violence. His dark eyes were fixed on her, unblinking and unreadable. Martha's hands shook uncontrollably as she reached out, clutching the edges of her threadbare shawl. She looked at the half-eaten steak and the mound of potatoes on his plate. Her stomach cramped violently, but she didn't look at the food for herself. She looked at it for Thomas, who was hiding behind her massive leg, peering out with starving eyes. She took a ragged, wet breath. Mister? Her voice was a trembling, broken whisper, barely audible over the raucous noise of the saloon. Theron did not move. "Speak up, woman." Martha squeezed her eyes shut for a brief second, gathering the last fractured pieces of her dignity, and crushed them underfoot. She opened her eyes, looking directly into the mountain man's hardened face. "May we have your leftovers?" she asked. It was in that exact second that the fortress of ice around Theron Hatcher's heart cracked. He looked into her eyes. They were a striking, deep hazel, surrounded by the puffy, exhausted flesh of her face. But it wasn't the color that struck him. It was the sheer, devastating depth of the agony within them. Theron knew what a broken spirit looked like. He saw it in the mirror every time he washed his face in a freezing mountain stream. In Martha's eyes, he saw a woman who was dying, not just physically, though he could hear the wet rattle in her shallow breathing, but spiritually. He saw a mother who was actively enduring the fires of hell, enduring the cruelest humiliations of a merciless world, entirely for the sake of the small, fragile life hiding behind her skirt. He saw no greed in her. He saw no gluttony. He saw a terrifying, beautiful, and heartbreaking sacrifice. Those eyes broke him. They reached across the 10 years of his self-imposed isolation and violently yanked him back into the world of the living. Before Theron could speak, the mocking voice of Bart Clegg carried across the room. Bart had noticed Martha standing at the mountain man's table and saw an opportunity for a greater show. "Hey, mountain man!" Bart shouted, stepping away from the stove, a half-empty bottle of rye in his hand. "I'd watch your fingers if I were you. That sow will bite 'em clean off. She's already eaten half the town's winter rations." The saloon erupted into a chorus of guffaws and cruel whistles. A few men slammed their mugs on the tables in amusement. Martha flinched as if she had been physically struck by a bullwhip. A single hot tear escaped her right eye, cutting a clean path down her dirty, swollen cheek. She began to immediately pull away, her oversized body shrinking in on itself, grabbing Thomas's hand. I'm sorry to bother you, sir," she whispered hurriedly, looking down at the sawdust-covered floor. "I shouldn't have asked. Forgive me." She turned to lumber away, wanting only to escape back out into the freezing mud of Chestnut Street, where the cold was at least indifferent to her misery. "Stop." The word was not shouted. It was spoken in a low, vibrating baritone that somehow managed to cut through the noise of the entire saloon. It held the heavy, undeniable authority of an avalanche waiting to happen. Martha froze. Thomas whimpered, gripping her skirt tighter. Theron stood up. When he rose from the chair, it seemed as though he kept unfolding. At 6'4", wearing the heavy elk-hide coat, he cast a shadow that swallowed Martha and her son entirely. The casual chatter in the immediate vicinity of his table died out instantly. Theron reached down to the table. He picked up the plate containing the half-eaten steak and potatoes. Martha watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected him to dump it on her head. It had happened before in other towns, a cruel joke played on the fat, starving widow. She braced herself for the humiliation. Instead, Theron turned his body and tossed the entire ceramic plate onto the floor about 10 feet away. It shattered loudly, scattering the beef and potatoes into the dirty sawdust. 2 saloon dogs immediately rushed over to fight for the scraps. Martha let out a small, wounded gasp. The rejection was absolute. The hope of a meal for Thomas was gone. She felt the heavy, dark waves of despair pull her under. "Come, Thomas," she choked out, her voice breaking. "Let's go." "I told you to stop," Theron said, his voice softer this time, though the gravelly undertone remained. He stepped out from behind the small table, placing his massive body between Martha and the front doors of the saloon. He looked down at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. Then, Theron Hatcher turned his head and locked his dark, dangerous eyes on Bart Clegg, who was still standing near the stove, grinning like a fool. The silence that spread through Pap Wyman's saloon was not sudden, but rather a fast-moving contagion. As men noticed the towering mountain man stepping out from his corner, their laughter died in their throats. The clinking of glasses ceased. Even the tinny piano in the corner sputtered to an awkward halt. Bart Clegg's drunken grin faltered slightly under the weight of Theron's stare, but he was surrounded by his mining buddies, and his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. What are you looking at, Grizzly?" Bart sneered, puffing out his chest. "I was just doing you a favor. That fat cow is a nuisance. Nothing but an eyesore taking up space in a town for working folk." Theron didn't say a word. He began to walk across the room. He moved with a terrifying grace, his heavy boots making barely a sound on the floorboards. Men scrambled to pull their chairs out of his path. The sheer physical threat radiating from him was palpable. When Theron reached the center of the room, he stopped, leaving about 10 feet between him and Bart. "You think a man's worth is measured by how loud he can mock a starving mother?" Theron asked, his voice low, steady, and echoing perfectly in the dead silent room. Bart shifted his weight, glancing nervously at his friends who were suddenly looking very interested in their boots. I just said she's a nuisance. Her husband owed us all money when he died. Now she begs like a stray dog. Look at her. She ain't starving." In a flash of movement so fast it defied his massive size, Theron's hand dropped to his belt. There was a sharp hiss of leather, a flash of dull steel, and a heavy thunk. Bart Clegg stumbled backward, a strangled yelp escaping his lips. Embedded 3 inches deep into the wooden post mere centimeters from Bart's right ear was Theron's hunting knife, a massive piece of forged steel with an elk antler handle. The blade was still vibrating. "The next word that comes out of your mouth," Theron said, his voice dropping to a demonic whisper that carried effortlessly across the room, "will be your last. You will gather your friends, and you will walk out those doors. If I see you look at her again, I will skin you alive and leave you for the ravens. Nod if you understand." Bart, his face completely drained of color, his knees trembling, gave a frantic, terrified nod. "Leave," Theron commanded. Bart didn't bother retrieving his half-empty bottle. He and 3 of his companions practically tripped over each other as they scrambled out the swinging bat-wing doors, disappearing into the freezing, muddy night. Theron walked forward, casually grabbed the handle of his knife, and yanked it free from the heavy timber. He slid it back into its sheath without breaking his stride as he walked back toward his corner table. The rest of the saloon remained in stunned, breathless silence. Theron reached Martha. She was standing exactly where he had left her, trembling violently, her eyes wide with shock and a new kind of terror. No one had ever defended her, not since Arthur. Theron looked at her, the terrifying anger in his face washing away, replaced by a strange, profound gentleness that seemed entirely out of place on his rugged features. He looked toward the bar. "O'Malley!" The bartender jumped. "Yes, sir?" Theron reached into his heavy leather pouch and pulled out a solid gold nugget the size of a walnut. He tossed it through the air. It landed on the mahogany bar with a heavy, expensive thud. "Clean a table near the stove," Theron ordered. "I want a fresh steak, the biggest one you have, potatoes, carrots, bread, butter, and a pitcher of sweet milk, and a slice of apple pie if you have it." "Right away, mister, right away!" O'Malley scrambled, grabbing a rag and rushing toward a large table near the iron stove that radiated a beautiful, intense heat. Theron turned back to Martha. He didn't offer her his leftovers. He didn't offer her scraps. He extended his large, calloused hand, gesturing toward the newly cleaned table by the fire. "Ma'am, if you and the boy would do me the honor of joining me for dinner." Martha stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The shock was absolute. The word ma'am echoed in her mind. It was a title of respect, of dignity. A tear spilled over her eyelashes, and this time she didn't try to hide it. I can't pay you for this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I have nothing." "I didn't ask for payment," Theron said softly. "I asked for company." He stepped past her, pulled out one of the heavy wooden chairs near the stove, and waited. Slowly, Almost as if she believed she were walking into a dream, Martha shuffled toward the table. The heat from the iron stove washed over her freezing, aching body like a blessing. She eased her massive frame into the chair, sighing as the weight was finally taken off her painfully swollen legs. Thomas, wide-eyed and cautious, climbed into the chair beside her. Theron took a seat opposite them. For the first time in 10 years, he found himself caring about the comfort of another human being. When O'Malley brought the food, the smell alone made Thomas whimper. A massive, freshly seared steak, steaming vegetables, and a pitcher of milk. "Eat, son," Theron said to the boy, pushing the plate toward him. Martha watched her son tear into the soft bread and potatoes with a ravenous desperation that broke her heart all over again. She picked up a fork with a trembling hand, taking a small piece of the beef. As the rich, hot food hit her tongue, a sob caught in her throat. She closed her eyes, chewing slowly, savoring the first real meal she had eaten in months. "My name is Martha," she said quietly, opening her eyes to look at the giant of a man across from her. "Martha Higgins, and this is Thomas." "Theron Hatcher," he replied, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "Why did you do this, Mr. Hatcher?" Martha asked, her deep hazel eyes searching his face. "Look at me. Look at what they think of me. Why did you stand up for a woman like me?" Theron looked at the heavy, exhausted, deeply scarred woman. He saw past the physical weight. He saw the endurance of a mountain. He saw a soul that had been beaten against the rocks of the world and had refused to entirely shatter. "Because, Mrs. Higgins," Theron said softly, the flickering light of the stove dancing in his dark eyes, "a wolf doesn't apologize for surviving the winter, and you have the eyes of a survivor. I respect that above all things." As Martha took another bite of the food, tears streaming freely down her face, Theron realized something profound. He'd come down the mountain to gather supplies and return to his frozen isolation, but looking at Martha and the boy, he knew with absolute certainty that his days of hiding from the world were over. The warmth of the iron stove in Pap Wyman's saloon was a stark contrast to the bitter, freezing reality waiting just beyond the bat-wing doors. As Martha Higgins finished the last crumb of her meal, a deep, profound exhaustion washed over her. It was the heavy, bone-deep weariness of a woman who had been running on pure adrenaline and terror for 8 months. Beside her, little Thomas had already succumbed to a full stomach and the radiant heat, his head resting softly against his mother's swollen thigh, fast asleep. Theron Hatcher sat across from them, nursing his second glass of whiskey. He watched the firelight dance across Martha's pale, puffy features. Now that she wasn't cowering, he could see the underlying structure of her face. Beneath the severe edema and the layers of dirt, there was a quiet, enduring beauty. Her jaw was strong, and those deep hazel eyes held an intelligence that the cruel miners of Leadville had completely overlooked. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" Theron asked, his voice a low rumble that didn't disturb the sleeping child. Martha looked down, her cheeks flushing with a renewed sense of shame. "Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, he lets us sleep in the back stall of the livery, in the hay. It's out of the wind, mostly." Theron's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his rust-colored beard. "A woman in your condition, and a child, sleeping in a freezing barn. What of your husband's friends, his crew?" "Arthur worked the matchless mine," Martha said softly, wrapping her frayed shawl tighter around her broad shoulders. "When Horace Tabor bought it out, things changed. The quotas went up. Arthur died in a collapse trying to meet the new silver yields. He owed money to a man named Silas Cobb." She paused, her breath catching. "Cobb runs a loan operation out of the red light district. When Arthur died, Cobb took our cabin, our belongings, everything, claiming it was collateral. He said if I didn't pay the rest of the interest, he'd take Thomas and sell him to a work camp in Nevada." Theron's eyes grew cold, resembling the frozen tarns high up in the alpine tundra. He knew of men like Silas Cobb. The frontier was bleeding with them, parasites who fed on the desperation of the working class. "You cannot stay in Leadville," Theron stated flatly. "The winter here will kill you. If the cold doesn't stop your heart, the dropsy will. You are carrying too much water in your blood, Martha. Your breathing is shallow, your legs are failing. Martha smiled, a tragic, broken expression. I know, Mr. Hatcher, I am dying. I pray every night that the Lord takes me quickly, but only after I can find a safe place for my boy. But there is nowhere to go. I am trapped in this frozen hell. Theron leaned forward, resting his massive calloused forearms on the wooden table. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming, yet Martha felt no fear, only an unexpected anchoring safety. I have a cabin, Theron said, his voice dropping to a private, serious register. High up in the Sawatch Range, near the tree line of Mount Massive. It is heavily timbered, well stocked with elk meat, dried goods, and firewood to last 3 winters. It is isolated. Nobody goes up there, and nobody comes down. Martha stared at him, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I am leaving at first light, Theron continued, his dark eyes locked onto hers. I want you and the boy to come with me. The saloon around them seemed to fade away. The clinking of glasses, the raucous laughter, the tinny piano, it all dissolved into a low hum. You want to take me? Martha stammered, deeply bewildered. Mr. Hatcher, look at me. I'm a crippled fat widow. I cannot hike a mountain. I will slow you down. I will be a burden. Why would you offer this to a woman you just met? What? I lived the last 10 years of my life believing that humanity was a disease, Theron answered, his voice thick with an emotion he had long thought dead. I watched the world take my wife and daughter, and I turned my back on it. But watching you tonight, watching you swallow your pride, endure the mockery of lesser men, all to feed your son, it woke something up in me. I am not offering you charity, Martha. I am offering you sanctuary. As for your legs, I have a pack mule. I will build a travois. You will not have to walk. Tears welled in Martha's eyes again. It was a terrifying proposition, to leave the only town she knew, to venture into the untamed, brutal wilderness with a giant of a man she had met an hour ago. But the alternative was returning to a freezing pile of hay, waiting for Silas Cobb to steal her child, or waiting for her failing heart to give out in the snow. She looked down at Thomas's sleeping face. He was so small, so fragile. He deserved a fire. He deserved a full belly. Martha took a deep, shuddering breath and met the mountain man's gaze. We will be ready at first light, Mr. Hatcher. The dawn broke over Leadville like a bruised plum, spilling a cold, gray light across the frozen mud of Chestnut Street. The air was a biting 10 degrees below zero, snapping at exposed skin like angry wasps. True to his word, Theron was waiting outside the livery stable as the sun crested the peaks. Barnaby, his massive, sure-footed pack mule, was outfitted with a modified travois, a sturdy sled constructed from thick pine poles and heavy canvas, cushioned with 3 layers of thick, tanned bear hides. Martha emerged from the stable, carrying Thomas. She moved with agonizing slowness, her joints stiff from the freezing night, her breathing already labored. Theron stepped forward, taking Thomas from her arms with surprising gentleness, and settling the boy into the front of the sled, wrapping him in a thick wool blanket. Next, he turned to Martha. Step up, Mrs. Higgins. Lean your weight on me. Martha hesitated, deeply embarrassed by her size. I am too heavy, Mr. Hatcher. I will break the sled. I felled these pines myself, Theron said, offering his massive arm. They can hold a bull moose. You will not break it. With his immense strength supporting her, Martha managed to lower her large frame onto the bear hides. The moment she sat, Theron tucked a heavy fur-lined buffalo robe around her shoulders and legs, effectively shielding her from the biting wind. The journey is brutal, Theron warned, checking the leather harnesses on Barnaby. We climbed 3,000 feet in elevation today. The air will get thinner. You must tell me if your chest begins to hurt. Do not hide your pain from me out of pride, Martha. Understand? I understand, Theron, she said softly, using his first name for the first time. The ascent began. Leaving the chaotic, smoke-choked air of Leadville behind, they entered the pristine, silent cathedral of the Rockies. The trail was treacherous, a narrow ribbon of ice and packed snow winding through dense stands of blue spruce and lodgepole pine. Theron walked ahead, his heavy boots breaking the trail, his keen eyes scanning the ridges for predators or unstable snowpack. For the first few hours, the rhythmic swaying of the sled and the warmth of the furs lulled Thomas back to sleep. But as they climbed higher, the true brutality of the mountain revealed itself. By early afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, violently dark purple. The wind began to howl through the canyons, carrying horizontal sheets of stinging ice. A high-altitude blizzard had arrived, sudden and merciless. "Cover your faces!" Theron roared over the deafening scream of the wind. The temperature plummeted. Every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. Martha pulled the buffalo robe over Thomas's head, shielding him entirely, but she left her own face partially exposed to keep an eye on Theron. The mountain man was a force of nature. He leaned into the blinding snow, his massive legs driving like pistons, pulling the heavy mule forward by the lead rope when the beast hesitated. Ice froze in his thick red beard, giving him the appearance of a frost giant. But inside the sled, Martha was dying. The extreme elevation, nearing 10,000 feet, combined with the freezing cold, was too much for her weakened, fluid-filled heart. A crushing, vice-like pain gripped her chest. Her lips turned a frightening shade of blue, and she began to gasp, struggling to pull the thin, freezing oxygen into her failing lungs. "Theron!" she tried to scream, but it came out as a weak, pathetic croak, stolen instantly by the wind. She reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing the leather trace of the sled and yanking it weakly. Theron felt the vibration. He stopped Barnaby instantly and rushed back to the sled, dropping to his knees in the deep snow beside her. "Martha!" he shouted, pulling the frost-covered robe back. Her eyes were rolling back in her head. She was drowning in the fluid in her own lungs, exacerbated by the altitude. "Leave me," she gasped, her hands weakly pushing at his chest. "Take Thomas. Get to the cabin. You can't pull this weight in the snow. I am done." Theron's heart slammed against his ribs, the ghosts of his past, the memory of watching his wife take her last breath while he stood by, powerless, roared to life in his mind. The ice wall he had built around his soul didn't just crack this time, it shattered into a million pieces. "No!" Theron roared, a sound that defied the howling blizzard. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "I didn't pull you from the mud of Leadville just to let the snow take you. Do you hear me? You are not dying today, Martha Higgins. You will not leave your son." He stripped off his own heavy elk-hide coat, completely ignoring the lethal freezing wind tearing at his woolen shirt. He wrapped the massive body-heat-warmed coat entirely around Martha's upper torso. Then, Theron Hatcher did the impossible. He unhooked Barnaby from the sled. He grabbed the thick leather harnesses himself, wrapping them tightly around his own massive shoulders and forearms. "Barnaby, get up front and break the powder!" Theron commanded the mule. With a primal earth-shaking bellow, Theron leaned his 6'4", 250-pound frame forward. His boots dug deep into the icy trail. Veins bulged in his neck as he strained against the immense weight of the sled, the woman, and the child. He became the beast of burden. Driven by a desperate, terrifying need to keep this woman alive, Theron physically dragged the sled up the final agonizing mile of the steep alpine trail. When they finally broke through the tree line, a small, sturdy log cabin emerged from the whiteout. It was nestled securely against a massive rock face, shielded from the worst of the wind. Theron dragged the sled right to the heavy oak door. He kicked it open. Shedding the harness, he scooped Martha's massive, unconscious form into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her over the threshold into the dark, freezing cabin, immediately followed by a terrified Thomas. Theron kicked the door shut, sealing out the blizzard. The survival of the woman in his arms now depended entirely on his speed and knowledge of the wild. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged outside the cabin, screaming against the thick pine logs like a chorus of angry ghosts. But inside, a furious battle for life was being waged by the light of a roaring hearth. Martha hovered on the very edge of the abyss. The dropsy and the altitude sickness had caused a severe fever. She lay on Theron's large bed, drowning in delirium, sweating profusely while shivering under layers of thick furs. Theron did not sleep. He became a relentless, tireless physician, drawing upon years of surviving alone and the herbal knowledge he had learned from a Ute elder a decade ago. He went to work. He brewed dark, bitter teas from dried dandelion root, willow bark, and juniper berries, potent natural diuretics and anti-inflammatories. He sat by her side hour after hour, gently lifting her heavy head and patiently forcing the warm liquid past her cracked lips. He applied snow-packed cloths to her burning forehead and massaged her painfully swollen calves with rendered bear fat and pine oil, attempting to stimulate the circulation and push the pooled fluid out of her extremities. Through it all, he spoke to her. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he kept his deep, gravelly voice a constant, anchoring presence in the dark room. He told her about the mountains. He told her about the herd of elk that migrated through the valley. He told her she was too stubborn to die. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind finally died down, leaving a profound, ringing silence in the high country. Theron was sitting in a wooden rocking chair by the bed, his chin resting on his chest, exhausted beyond measure. Little Thomas was asleep on a pile of furs near the blazing fireplace. A soft, raspy sound broke the silence. "Water?" Theron's head snapped up. Martha's deep hazel eyes were open. They were bloodshot and exhausted, but the glassy sheen of the fever had broken. The terrifying blue tint had left her lips. Theron quickly poured a tin cup of fresh, cool mountain water from a bucket and brought it to her lips. She drank greedily. As she settled back onto the pillows, Martha looked down at her hands. The skin, which had been stretched tight and painful for months, was remarkably loose. The potent herbal diuretics and the profuse sweating had forced gallons of trapped fluid from her body. She was still a woman of substantial size. That was simply her natural build. But the sickly, puffy bloat of the dropsy was vastly diminished. She looked up at the giant, bearded man sitting beside her. His eyes were rimmed with dark, bruised circles of fatigue, but they burned with a quiet, triumphant light. "You saved me," Martha whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You fought," Theron corrected gently. "I just gave you the weapons. Welcome back, Martha." Over the next 4 weeks, the cabin transformed. The isolated fortress of a grieving mountain man became a home. As Martha regained her strength, the true woman beneath the tragedy began to emerge. With the crippling water weight gone, she could walk without pain. She took over the cooking, taking the lean elk meat, wild onions, and dried beans Theron provided, and turning them into hearty, rich stews that filled the cabin with the scent of a real home. She patched their clothes. She hummed softly while she swept the rough-hewn floorboards. Theron, too, began to change. The heavy, suffocating silence he had worn like armor for 10 years melted away. He found himself looking forward to waking up. He spent his afternoons teaching Thomas how to carve small animals out of soft pine wood and how to read the tracks of the snowshoe hares in the powder outside. One evening, as a fierce snowstorm battered the cabin walls, Theron and Martha sat in front of the roaring fire. Thomas was already asleep in the loft. Theron was sharpening his hunting knife with a whetstone. Martha was mending a tear in his heavy wool shirt. The comfortable domestic silence stretched between them, thick and warm. Martha paused her stitching and looked at him. The firelight caught the red hues in his beard and the deep, soulful sadness that still lingered in his eyes, though it was fading day by day. "Theron," she said softly. He looked up, the rhythmic scraping of the whetstone stopping. "Yes, Martha. Why did you leave the world behind?" she asked. It was a bold question, one she wouldn't have dared ask a month ago, but they had crossed a boundary of intimacy when he pulled her back from death's door. Theron stared into the flames for a long time. The muscles in his jaw worked tightly. "Cholera," he finally said, his voice a low, painful rasp. 10 years ago in Missouri, it took my wife, Sarah, and my daughter, Clara. They died in my arms 3 days apart. I couldn't stop it. I was a strong man. I could clear a field. I could build a barn. But I couldn't fight a sickness in the water. The helplessness, it broke my mind. I came to the mountains because the rocks don't die. The trees don't leave you. I thought if I never loved anything again, I could never be broken again. Martha set the shirt down. She pushed herself up from her chair, walked over to him, and knelt beside his chair. It was a fluid movement, impossible for her just a month ago. She reached out, placing her warm, capable hand over his large, scarred one, stopping the whetstone completely. To love in this world is a terrible risk, Theron, she said, her deep hazel eyes locked onto his, shining with fierce empathy. It is the greatest risk there is, but to live without it, that isn't living. That is just waiting to die in the cold. Theron looked at her. He saw the scars of her life, the substantial curves of a woman who had weathered the storms of starvation, humiliation, and a failing heart. And in that moment, he didn't see a widow he had rescued. He saw the most beautiful, resilient creature he had ever known. He turned his hand over, lacing his thick fingers through hers, squeezing gently. The ice around his heart was gone, replaced by a terrifying, wonderful warmth. But down in the valley, the world they thought they had left behind was mobilizing. In Leadville, Silas Cobb sat behind his mahogany desk in a smoky back room of a brothel. Across from him stood Bart Clegg, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. "So," Cobb said smoothly, taking a drag from a thin cigar, "you're telling me the fat widow didn't just crawl into an alley and die. You're telling me a mountain man took her up to the Sawatch Range." "Yes, Mr. Cobb," Bart stammered. "Giant of a man, vicious. Nearly took my ear off with a hunting knife." Cobb smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. He pulled a piece of parchment from his desk drawer. It was an assay report. "Arthur Higgins wasn't just a poor miner, Bart," Cobb purred. "Before the collapse, Arthur found a secondary vein in the Matchless, unregistered, pure wire silver. He drew a map, and I know for a fact he hid it in the lining of his wife's heavy winter shawl. She doesn't even know she's carrying a fortune." Cobb stood up, strapping a heavy Colt revolver to his waist. "Gather 5 men. Bring rifles and snowshoes. We're going up the mountain to collect my property." The high alpine winter held the Sawatch Range in an iron grip, but inside the sturdy log cabin, a profound thaw was underway. As January bled into February, Martha Higgins underwent a physical and spiritual resurrection. The herbal tinctures Theron brewed, combined with the pure mountain water and a diet rich in lean elk protein, had completely flushed the deadly dropsy from her system. She remained a woman of grand, imposing stature, her broad shoulders and heavy hips a natural testament to her formidable constitution, but the sickly, fluid-filled bloat that had nearly stopped her heart was entirely gone. Her deep hazel eyes, once clouded with the terror of impending death, now sparkled with a fierce, grounding vitality. One bitterly cold afternoon, while Theron was outside chopping firewood and little Thomas was stacking the kindling, Martha sat by the hearth with her mending basket. She'd finally decided to repair the heavy, frayed woolen shawl that had shielded her through the darkest days in Leadville. As she dragged a heavy bone needle through the thick collar of the garment, the point struck something stiff, hidden deep within the lining. Frowning, Martha pinched the fabric. It didn't feel like bundled wool. It felt like folded parchment. Carefully, she snipped the threads of the inner seam. She reached inside and pulled out a small, tightly folded piece of heavy canvas paper, stained with coal dust and sweat. Unfolding it, Martha's breath caught in her throat. It was a hand-drawn map of the Matchless Mine's lower tunnels. The handwriting unmistakably belonged to her late husband, Arthur. At the bottom edge of the paper, in Arthur's hurried, blocky script, were the words, "Southwest Drift, past the false timber, pure wire silver, unregistered for Martha and Thomas." Tears pricked her eyes. Arthur hadn't died a penniless debtor. He'd found a massive hidden vein of pure silver and was mapping it to secure a private claim for their family's future before the mountain collapsed on him. The heavy wooden door swung open, bringing a swirl of snow and the massive fur-clad frame of Theron into the cabin. He stomped his boots, shaking the white powder from his rust-colored beard. He immediately noticed Martha standing by the fire, her hands trembling as she held the parchment. "Martha?" Theron asked, dropping the firewood into the iron bin. What is it? Are you ill? No, Theron, she whispered, handing him the stiff paper. Arthur didn't leave us with nothing. He left us a map to a fortune. Theron's dark eyes scanned the precise geological drawings, his brow furrowed. Having lived in the Colorado Territory for a decade, he knew the ruthless politics of Leadville's mining syndicates. A map like this wasn't just a promise of wealth, it was a death warrant. Who else knew about this? Theron asked, his voice dropping to a gravelly serious register. No one, Martha said, though a cold dread began to pool in her stomach. At least I didn't think so. But the loan shark who took our cabin, Ezekiel Cobb. He tore our home apart looking for something before he kicked us into the street. He claimed Arthur owed him money, but Arthur never took loans. Cobb must have known Arthur found a strike. Theron folded the map carefully, tucking it into a leather pouch on his belt. The tranquil peace of the mountain suddenly felt fragile. Ezekiel Cobb is a predator. Predators do not stop hunting when they smell blood. He sent men to watch you in Leadville. He let you starve, hoping desperation would force you to hand this over. He didn't account for you leaving the mountain. Meanwhile, 3,000 feet below, a line of 6 men trudged through the brutal waist-deep snow of the Alpine Trail. Ezekiel Cobb rode a massive black gelding, wrapped in a heavy bearskin coat, his cruel face shielded by a wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, Bart Clegg and 4 hired mercenaries from the saloons pushed forward on snowshoes, cursing the bitter cold. "How much further, Clegg?" Cobb shouted over the howling wind, his hand resting on the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. "Smoke's rising just over the next ridge, boss," Bart yelled back, his face red and wind-burned. "That giant's cabin is tucked into the rock face. But I'm telling you, the man ain't natural. He's a savage." "I don't care if he's the devil himself," Cobb snarled, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "That fat widow has a map worth $100,000 stitched into her rags. We kill the mountain man, we grab the paper, and we leave the woman and the brat for the wolves." The men checked the actions on their Winchester rifles. The slaughter was imminent. It was the sudden, eerie silence of the wilderness that gave them away. Theron had stepped out onto the cabin's wrap-around porch to fetch a bucket of snow for melting. The wind had died down, but the usual chattering of the red squirrels and the harsh cawing of the Steller's jays were completely absent. The forest was holding its breath. Then Barnaby the mule, tied securely in the heavy timber lean-to beside the cabin, pinned his long ears flat against his head and let out a low, warning snort, stomping his heavy hooves against the frozen earth. Theron dropped the bucket. His wilderness instincts, honed over 10 years of survival, screamed a terrifying warning. He lunged back inside, slamming the heavy oak door and throwing the massive iron deadbolt into place. "Get on the floor," Theron ordered, his voice a low, vibrating hum of absolute authority. "Now, Martha, take Thomas and get into the root cellar beneath the rug." Martha didn't ask questions. She saw the lethal, hyper-focused predator emerge in Theron's eyes. She grabbed a terrified Thomas, threw back the heavy bearskin rug in the center of the room, and hoisted the heavy wooden trap door. "Theron, what is it?" she asked as she lowered her son into the dark, earth-smelling cavity. "Company," Theron grunted, grabbing his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle from its mantel mounts. He checked the breech, sliding a massive .50 caliber brass cartridge into the chamber. "Keep the boy quiet. Do not come out until I call your name." Martha nodded, lowering her large frame into the cellar and pulling the trapdoor shut. Total darkness enveloped her, save for the thin slits of light from the floorboards. She pulled Thomas to her massive chest, wrapping her arms around him, becoming a human shield. Outside, Ezekiel Cobb held up a gloved hand, halting his men at the edge of the tree line. The cabin sat 40 yards away, a fortress of thick pine logs. "Spread out," Cobb hissed to his mercenaries. "Surround the perimeter. Clegg, you're with me at the front." Cobb drew his revolver and stepped out of the timber, walking confidently into the clearing. "Hatcher," he shouted, his voice echoing sharply against the granite cliffs. "I know you're in there. I don't want any trouble with you. Send out the widow and the boy, and we'll leave you to your peace." Inside, Theron stood beside the thick window frame, peering through a small chink in the wooden shutters. He counted the men, 6 heavily armed thugs. They were fanning out, trying to flank the cabin. "This is private land, Cobb." Theron's deep voice boomed from the cabin, cutting through the freezing air like a physical force. "You have 10 seconds to turn around before you become fertilizer for the spring thaw." Cobb laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "You're outnumbered, mountain man! Light it up, boys!" Gunfire erupted, shattering the alpine silence. The mercenaries unleashed a volley of lead from their Winchester rifles. Bullets tore into the thick pine logs of the cabin with deafening thuds, sending splinters of wood flying into the interior. Theron didn't flinch. He remained perfectly calm, operating with a cold, terrifying efficiency. He stepped to a small gun port he had carved into the log specifically for this purpose. He aimed the massive Sharps rifle at a mercenary trying to flank the left side near the lean-to. Theron squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle roared like a cannon. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but the resulting impact was devastating. The .50 caliber slug struck the mercenary dead center, lifting him off his snowshoes and throwing him backward into a snowbank. He didn't move again. "One," Theron whispered, calmly reloading the breech. Cobb's eyes went wide. "Keep firing! Break the door down!" Bart Clegg and another man charged the porch, firing wildly at the shutters. But Theron knew the terrain intimately. He had rigged defensive measures years ago to protect his home from grizzly bears. As Bart and the mercenary hit the wooden steps of the porch, Theron pulled a heavy iron lever mounted near the doorframe. Outside, a massive spiked log, a deadfall trap suspended in the porch overhang, dropped with bone-crushing force. It completely missed Bart, who had tripped on the top step, but it caught the mercenary beside him, pinning him to the porch floor with a sickening crunch. Bart screamed in pure terror, scrambling backward off the porch and diving behind a water barrel. "He's killing us, Mr. Cobb! The man is a demon!" Theron moved to the right window, grabbing his Winchester repeater to match their fire rate. He laid down suppressing fire, forcing Cobb and the remaining 2 men to dive for cover behind heavy boulders. But Cobb was cunning. While Theron was focused on the front, one of the mercenaries had managed to crawl around to the back of the cabin. The man kicked in the small back window and shoved the barrel of his rifle through. Martha, hiding in the root cellar, saw the boots of the mercenary through the floorboards. She heard the man cock the hammer of his rifle, aiming it directly at Theron's unprotected back as Theron fired out the front. In that terrifying microsecond, Martha Higgins did not freeze. The maternal protective fury of a bear whose cub was threatened surged through her veins. She would not let this mountain man, the man who had saved her, die for her. With astonishing speed and power for a woman her size, Martha thrust her massive hands upward, slamming the heavy wooden trapdoor violently into the legs of the mercenary. The man yelped in surprise as the floor exploded beneath him. His rifle fired wildly into the ceiling. Martha heaved herself out of the cellar, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. As the mercenary struggled to regain his balance, Martha swung the solid iron bar with all the immense, formidable strength her heavy frame possessed. It struck the man's rifle, snapping the wooden stock in half, and the follow-through caught him in the jaw. He collapsed to the floorboards, unconscious. Theron spun around at the commotion, his eyes widening as he saw Martha standing over the downed man, breathing heavily, the iron poker gripped in her hands. "Stay down!" Theron yelled, but the distraction cost him. Ezekiel Cobb had reached the porch. He kicked the shattered remnants of the door open, leveling his Colt revolver directly at Theron's chest. "Map! Now!" Cobb snarled, his finger whitening on the trigger. Before Cobb could fire, Theron didn't use a gun. He reached to his belt in a blur of motion, pulling the heavy elk antler hunting knife, and threw it with terrifying, lethal precision. The heavy blade tumbled through the air and buried itself deep into Cobb's right shoulder. Cobb screamed, his revolver firing into the floorboards as he dropped it, stumbling backward onto the snow-covered porch. Theron crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbing Cobb by the collar of his expensive coat and dragged him inside. Outside, Bart Clegg saw his boss fall. Without a second thought, the cowardly miner dropped his rifle and sprinted blindly into the dense freezing woods, choosing the mercy of the wilderness over the wrath of the mountain man. The remaining mercenary followed him. Silence fell over the cabin once more, save for the groans of the wounded Ezekiel Cobb. Theron stood over the loan shark, his massive chest heaving. He looked back at Martha. She was untouched, standing defiantly between the cellar and the intruders. The sheer courage in her deep hazel eyes completely took his breath away. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a warrior. When the spring thaw finally broke the winter's hold on the Rockies, turning the frozen creeks into roaring torrents of white water, Theron and Martha made their descent into the valley. They did not go to Leadville. They traveled all the way to Denver, presenting Arthur's map and geological evidence directly to Judge Moses Hallett at the territorial courthouse. With Ezekiel Cobb dead from his wounds and his corrupt empire in Leadville crumbling in his absence, the courts recognized Martha Higgins as the sole legal owner of the southwest drift of the matchless mine. A month later, Horace Tabor, the Silver King of Colorado, purchased the rights to that specific drift from Martha for a staggering sum of $150,000. It was a fortune that defied comprehension. But wealth did not change the core of who they were. They had both seen what greed had done to the souls of men in the mining camps. Instead of building a mansion in the polluted, chaotic streets of Denver or Leadville, Theron and Martha traveled south to the San Luis Valley. There, beneath the towering majesty of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, they purchased 3,000 acres of pristine, lush ranch land. On a bright, warm afternoon in late June, a small, private ceremony took place under a massive cottonwood tree near the banks of a winding, crystal-clear river. Theron Hatcher stood in a finely tailored dark suit, his rusted iron beard trimmed neatly. He looked at the woman walking toward him, and he felt a profound, overwhelming gratitude that he had chosen to eat his dinner in Pap Wyman's saloon that fateful night. Martha walked down the grassy aisle, holding Thomas's hand. She wore a beautiful sweeping dress of deep emerald silk that complemented her rich hazel eyes. She was still a large, imposing woman, but she no longer hid her size and shame. She carried herself with the majestic grace of a queen. The mountain air, the clean water, and the profound love she shared with Theron had transformed her. She was a picture of robust health, her skin glowing, her deep laughter a constant melody in their new home. As they exchanged vows, Theron took her large, warm hand in his scarred ones. "I thought the world was a graveyard," Theron whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You taught me it was a garden. You gave me back my soul, Martha." Martha smiled, a tear of pure joy tracking down her cheek. "And you gave me a safe place to plant my roots, Theron. You were my sanctuary in the storm." Over the next 20 years, the Hatcher Ranch became a legendary establishment in the Colorado Territory. Theron and Martha turned the land into a prosperous cattle and horse breeding operation. They became known not just for their wealth, but for their boundless generosity. No traveler was ever turned away hungry. No widow or orphan in the valley ever faced the winter without a warm coat and a full belly, courtesy of Martha Hatcher. Thomas grew into a massive, capable frontiersman, inheriting his stepfather's survival skills and his mother's deep, unshakable empathy. He eventually took over the ranch, raising a family of his own on the beautiful, sprawling acreage. Theron and Martha grew old together, their love only deepening with the passing of time. They spent their evenings sitting on the wide, wrap-around porch of their sprawling ranch house, watching the sun dip behind the snow-capped peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range. Theron would often hold Martha's hand as the twilight settled over the valley, his mind drifting back to that freezing night in Leadville. He realized that the greatest treasure he had ever found was not buried deep within the dark, suffocating tunnels of a silver mine. The greatest treasure he ever found had walked up to his table, swallowed her pride for the love of her son, and asked for his leftovers. The eyes that had broken his hardened heart had ultimately put it back together, vastly stronger and infinitely more beautiful than before. What began as a desperate plea for leftovers in a frozen, unforgiving saloon transformed into a legendary tale of survival, redemption, and a love that conquered the untamed Rockies. If you found yourself captivated by Theron and Martha's powerful journey from the dark, freezing timberline to their beautiful sanctuary in the San Luis Valley, please take a moment to hit that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible real-life story of grit and romance with your friends. And subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic, historical tales from the Wild West. Your support keeps these legends alive.